This is a story about a love triangle that often ends in broken destinies, but this time the situation got completely out of control and led to the death of one of those involved in the tangled romance. Today, we will tell you how events unfolded in the lives of Eloise Bagnolini, Jesse Travaglini, and Alain Castel. Aubignon, at the foot of Mont Ventoux in France, was a suburb with 50 residents. It was a cozy village near Avignon where life moved at a leisurely pace, and the beauty of the surrounding nature made up for the lack of infrastructure. This was home to the Bagnolini and Castel family, which consisted of a 5-year-old child and his parents, Eloise and Alain. The couple was friendly and loving, known throughout much of the community. They were respectable and decent people. Neighbors often saw the young woman in her 30s with her child by the pool in the garden. She was an attractive blonde with a gentle personality. Eloise was rather shy, quiet, reserved, intelligent, and well-mannered. She loved her family above all else, her spouse and her child. She had a good education but did not work anywhere. She took care of the house and rarely went out. Her routine was limited to shopping or driving the child to school. Her husband, Alain Castel, led a more dynamic lifestyle. He worked for a large international food company as a team leader, a charismatic engineer who was handsome and confident, exuding these qualities. Naturally, such a spirited and temperamental person could not hide from women's attention. Time and again, women, particularly female employees at his company, practically went crazy for him. Eventually, this led to tragedy. On Friday, October 11, 2013, Alain was at work when he received a strange phone call in the afternoon. He was contacted by a teacher from the school his son attended, telling him to pick up the child because his wife had not done so. Eloise had sent a message to the teacher saying she couldn't come because of a nervous breakdown, but did not specify who would pick up her son. The teacher found this odd and tried to reach Eloise, but she did not answer the phone, so the teacher contacted the child's father. When Alain heard the story, he became worried. He knew Eloise had no serious plans that day preventing her from picking up their son from school. Even if something new had come up, she would have told him. The situation seemed unusual and not like his responsible wife, who had never acted that way before. Alain tried to reach his wife to clarify this strange situation, but she ignored all his calls. A short time later, she sent him a message saying she was going away and needed a few days to herself to find peace. This alarmed Alain. He apologized at work and headed home, worried that something terrible might have happened to his wife. When he arrived, he found a mess and bloodstains in the bathroom, but Eloise was nowhere to be seen. Suspecting his wife might have been the victim of a break-in, he called the police. Alain reported that his wife was missing and that there were signs of forced entry and a struggle. The officers arrived quickly at the family home. After inspecting the house, the investigators concluded that the situation was serious. The woman was missing, someone had broken in, and there was blood and disorder. It was likely Eloise had been the victim of a crime. She could have been kidnapped. The police put her on the missing persons list and began searching for her. They noticed that Eloise's closet was empty. Her husband also said he noticed some of her belongings and suitcases were gone, and her car was missing. The gendarmes suspected the wife might have gone on vacation, but Alain categorically denied this. His wife would never leave him and their child behind. The investigators questioned the family's neighbors, but none had seen or heard anything suspicious that day. Unfortunately, there were no surveillance cameras nearby to check what had happened. They also questioned Alain, who said he had gone to work in the morning while his wife got their son ready for school. He said goodbye to her, and everything seemed normal. There was no reason to worry. But that afternoon, he received a call from the school telling him to pick up his son and informing him of his wife's strange message. Alain was now certain the message had not come from his wife. Probably the kidnappers had sent it to buy time. Alain was unable to provide any useful information to the gendarmerie, who continued searching for the missing woman, hoping she was still alive. Through the media, they asked the public for help, hoping that a witness would come forward with valuable information about her whereabouts. 24 hours later, There was still no sign of life from Eloise Bagnolini. But the next evening, a distant neighbor of the couple, Claude, contacted the gendarmerie in connection with a different matter. The man lived just a few hundred meters from their house. He said that shortly before the woman's disappearance, he had seen an unfamiliar car in their neighborhood. This unknown vehicle was parked suspiciously close to his home and had apparently been abandoned in a hurry, which made the neighbor take note. The car was parked almost in the street, and there was no sign of its owner. All of this struck him as odd. When no one came for the car the next day, the man reported it to the police. When the officers arrived, they examined the suspicious vehicle and found it belonged to the missing woman. They opened the car to look for clues, but in the trunk they found the body of 30-year-old Eloise Bagnolini. The officers were stunned. Nothing like this had ever happened in their peaceful little town. It was incomprehensible who would want to harm a simple housewife who obviously had nothing to do with crime or dark deeds. The police immediately reported this grim discovery to her husband. The worst thing for Elaine was that his wife had been murdered in broad daylight in their cozy suburb, where everyone was their own master, and which seemed like the safest place in the world to him. She was found in the very neighborhood where she picked up their child from school every day. Elaine began to wonder whether this crime was only the beginning, and if the next victim would be their child or himself. These thoughts alarmed him. One thing was certain. The perpetrator was still at large and had already shown he was capable of killing. Panic spread among the locals. People were afraid to go outside and began locking their doors. In order to calm the public, the police needed to solve the case and put the dangerous criminal behind bars before another crime was committed. Thanks to a tip from a widower, the gendarmes quickly tracked down Jessie Travaglini. She was a mother herself and did not look like a murderer at all. She had no prior convictions, worked, took care of the household and a child, and was considered a decent woman. Jessie was born just 10 km from Avignon. In the summer of 2001, she met a man named Jean-Francois, who was very prominent and attractive. At that time, Jessie was a 16-year-old girl, and her new boyfriend was 5 years older, already 21. Despite an age difference that can seem large at that stage of life, she fell in love with him at first sight, convinced he was her future husband. The age difference did not bother her at all. She was active and assertive, which helped their romance progress quickly. She forgave him for all his shortcomings and smoothed out any conflicts between them. They truly loved each other. They were very happy in the first years. A young student and a professional rugby player who spent most of his time training seemed like the perfect couple. Jean-Francois was the team captain, taught a lot to up-and-coming athletes, and gave a good performance on the field. Their relationship developed fast, and no one was surprised when they soon moved in together and, a few years later, decided to make it official by getting married. Once Jessie reached adulthood, she became pregnant, and everything seemed to be going well. However, she had no steady job, and her boyfriend's sporting successes could not cover the growing needs of the young family. They had financial difficulties. Many people reproached them for deciding to become parents so early without having established themselves. Nevertheless, Jessie believed she had found a reliable support in life and didn't work. She became a housewife. Her husband had to provide for the family. Jean was so in love with her that he never went against her wishes. He agreed with her decisions and started taking on multiple jobs to earn enough money for her and provide for all her needs. But as it turned out, this was not so easy. His lack of education brought added difficulties at work. All the jobs he was offered were unsuitable because of low pay, but he had no other options, so he took whatever he could find. Jess gave birth to a son and was supposed to look after the household while her husband tried to make money. But once the child was born, the situation changed. The family grew, and so did their needs. A lot of money was spent on diapers, baby food, and toys. There was a catastrophic shortage of funds. The young mother realized her husband couldn't handle it all, and her role as a housewife wouldn't solve their financial problems, so she looked for a job and found one in the same company where the husband of the murdered Eloise worked. Jessie quickly got along with Elaine, whom she found very attractive, and soon they began a romantic relationship. When Jessie joined the company, she stood out at once. She was someone who wanted to develop further and advance her career. She was ready to move forward and play every card she had, and of them being her natural beauty. Some relatives noted that during this time, she began dressing provocatively to emphasize her attractiveness. Naturally, it was hard for Elaine not to notice her. However, he wasn't the only one in the company who flirted with the young Jess. At that time, Jessie was 25 and tired of living in poverty with her athlete husband. She wanted more. Many men at the firm were taken with her beauty and courted her, but Jessie chose Alain Castel, her boss. Alain was attractive and solid. They worked in the same department, often crossed paths, and gradually grew closer. Their affair was fraught with doubt. Both had been married for a long time and had children, so they worried about the moral implications. They also feared that rumors of their affair would soon spread among their colleagues, and eventually throughout the city, that their spouses would find out. However, they were so drawn to each other that one day they could no longer resist. They first became intimate right in the office. For days afterward, the lovers kept talking about it. Jess was ready to continue their physical relationship, but Elaine immediately made it clear that this was a one-time mistake. He loved his wife and didn't want to destroy his family. Jessie, however, had no intention of backing off. She increased the pressure on him until her new lover couldn't resist, and their romance continued. Despite the emotional torment, they couldn't stop. They admired each other and were in love. Elaine seemed incredibly caring and financially secure. He supported his lover and bought her expensive gifts. Jessie was not only beautiful and lively but also a pleasant person to talk to, and he found it easy to confide in her. She was delighted with his attention and the gifts he gave her. She initiated their meeting. Elaine felt guilty for cheating on his wife, but he lacked the self-control to refuse his mistress. Over time, Elaine's wife became suspicious about his affair as rumors spread. She started noticing her husband's strange behavior. One day, she followed him and caught him in the parking lot outside the office, driving off in his car with his lover. She trailed them further and saw them kissing in a parking area. This was a severe blow for her. That evening, Eloise confronted her husband about the affair. Elaine appeared very worried and promised to end his illicit liaison, and his wife believed him. He truly tried to keep his distance from Jess, but she took every opportunity at work to come on to him. She couldn't control herself anymore. The more they met, the more obsessed Jess became with Elaine. She followed him everywhere. One day, she even followed him on a ski vacation in the mountains with his family. It was one of many similar ski resorts where you could run into someone easily. Aylin was shocked to see his young lover suddenly there, tracking him the entire time. This stalking continued everywhere. Whenever Elaine went somewhere for work or personal reasons, Jess would inevitably appear. If he ate lunch in a cafe, she would always be sitting at the next table. A friend of Jessie's later said she openly admitted she felt an overwhelming attraction to her lover. She wanted to leave her husband, be with Elaine, and have children with him. Jessie longed to be near him constantly, even if just to look him in the eye or talk to him. Yet Elaine started ignoring her. Their affair lasted 3 years, during which time they met more than 24 times. But this poisonous relationship so exhausted Elaine that he decided to end it. He planned to move with his family away from the suburbs of Avignon, all the way to Brittany, to start anew. At that time, Elaine and Eloise were just recovering from their marital crisis. His wife believed him and knew he was avoiding meetings with his subordinate. Their family relationship improved, and they dreamed of having another child. Meanwhile, Jessie learned that her boss Aylin would not leave his family for her. She also found out he had rekindled his relationship with his wife, and that they were planning to have a second child. Most importantly, he wanted to move to another city to forget about her. She felt betrayed, abandoned, and believed it was all Eloise's fault. Jessie had hoped he would eventually decide to divorce and start a new relationship with her, but her hopes were not fulfilled. One day, her illusions simply shattered. In addition, her own husband discovered she was cheating and wanted to divorce her. As a result, she devised a terrible plan. She wanted to get rid of her rival, who stood in the way of her happiness, at least in her view. Friday, October 11, 2013, was a beautiful autumn day. Eloise came back from the supermarket. She needed to cook dinner for the whole family, so she hurried home. When she arrived, she unloaded the car and took the groceries to the kitchen. She was alone in the house at the time and was supposed to pick up her son from school, but that never happened. Just then, her husband's lover showed up at her home. Jess confessed her relationship with Alan to Eloise. Eloise realized who was standing in front of her and asked Jessie to leave and not bother her family anymore. Jessie, however, had no intention of leaving. She was determined to resolve the problem once and for all. They argued, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control until the women started fighting. Eloise soon realized she was at a disadvantage. Jessie was much stronger, and her aggression gave her even more strength. The lady of the house saw a free hallway, pushed her attacker away, and ran in that direction. Along the way, she tried every doorknob, looking for a room in which to hide from her pursuer. The only door that opened led to the bathroom. She ran inside and locked it. But now Eloise was trapped. She had nowhere to go, and did not have her cell phone to call for help. Her attacker broke down the door and caught up with her. They fought again, and Jess threw her to the floor and began choking her. Eloise was on her stomach as Jessie strangled her with a towel until her rival no longer showed any signs of life. The murderer did not panic. She decided to confuse the investigation and stage Eloise's voluntary departure from home. To that end, she prepared several of Eloise's suitcases, packed her belongings, and carried them out to the car. She then sent a message to the teacher saying she was suffering from a nervous breakdown. After that, the teacher personally contacted Elaine to have him pick up his son from school. Jessie also decided to draw suspicion away from herself and calm the widowed man's fears by sending him a message from Eloise's phone number, pretending to be Eloise, saying that she needed to go away and spend a few days alone to recover from a nervous breakdown and to find peace. However, that was not the end of her treacherous plan. She had only bought some time and now had to dispose of the corpse. She parked Eloise's car in front of the house so she could more discreetly drag the deceased woman into it from the bathroom, pulling her across the floor. She put her into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, drove about 200 meters, and left the car in a nearby residential parking lot. There, she disposed of the victim's phone, the towel she had used to commit the murder, and other incriminating items that might help investigators. Astonishingly, Jessie spent that same evening on vacation with friends, acting as if nothing had happened. When asked, most of those people said they hadn't noticed anything unusual about her behavior that day. She even seemed to be enjoying herself. Only a few people noted that she seemed more distant than usual, but this did not arouse suspicion. Meanwhile, the victim was already dead. A few days later, Jessie was overcome with remorse and went to her father, the person she trusted most, to tell him what had happened. He was the first to learn that his daughter had murdered Eloise Bagnolini. Jessie begged her father for help, describing the incident as an accident and self-defense. She truly believed the deceased had attacked her first and that she had no choice but to defend herself. It turned out the police already knew Jessie, given her inappropriate behavior, posed a potential threat to the victim, and was their main suspect since the victim had no other enemies or ill-wishers. Jessie's confession to her father allowed the gendarmes to arrest the 28-year-old murderer and take her into custody. She was charged with killing Eloise. Now all the circumstances of the crime had to be clarified to determine whether it was premeditated murder or manslaughter. Jessie was remorseful from the start but insisted she had acted purely in self-defense. Investigators doubted the defendant's words. She had clearly planned the act and tried to cover her tracks. Moreover, she had not even tried to help her rival. She could have called emergency services or administered first aid, but instead, she staged a disappearance. Investigators discovered that there had been no such call. What Jesse called an accidental death and self-defense increasingly looked like a carefully planned, premeditated murder. The offender also had a motive. She wanted to eliminate the wife in order to be with her lover again. She had taken the day off on October 11, and 3 weeks earlier she had purchased a stun gun with a built-in high-intensity flashlight, a self-defense device legally available on the market. A stun gun can stun, disorient, and immobilize an opponent with a strong electric shock. Jesse claimed she had bought these items for her own self-defense and had never intended to use them against Eloise. But the prosecution believed this was all part of her plan to get rid of her rival. She had blinded the victim, shocked her with the stun gun, and carried out her plan. The stun gun was later found in a trash bin near the victim's car, along with the towel used for strangulation. Both items bore Jesse's DNA and fingerprints. During the trial, the question arose whether the defendant would confess to premeditated murder. However, she continued to claim that Eloise had attacked her first. At the same time, Jesse had no injuries or signs of harm that might indicate a case of excessive self-defense, which seemed strange. Her story was highly questionable, whereas the forensic team found multiple injuries on the victim's body. According to the coroner, Eloise suffered them when Jess shook her, causing her to lose consciousness. The husband's lover was so furious that she didn't stop and continued shaking her. The forensic examination also showed that the strangulation took quite a while. The attacker pressed down on the victim's neck for about 5 minutes before letting go of her lifeless body. Therefore, this crime could not be labeled a momentary outburst, because in those 5 minutes she could have come to her senses and stopped, but she did not. The prosecutor insisted that it was a carefully planned crime. The defendant had bought the murder weapon, the stun gun, in advance to incapacitate the victim, taken the day off, gone specifically to the victim's home, strangled her in a rage, and then staged the victim's departure from the house. The defense dismissed the prosecutor's arguments. Until that point, Jesse had never been aggressive or involved in any criminal acts. Friends and acquaintances described her as calm, balanced, and non-confrontational, as well as a devoted mother. In the defense lawyer's view, it was an accidental death caused by fear and emotional strain on Elaine's lover. But there were witnesses among her colleagues who described Jesse as a true predator who tolerated no competition, either professionally or privately. The defense insisted that Jesse was the victim in this story, driven to despair. The accused had, for about 3 years, been under her lover's control. He treated her like an object, and she became dependent on him. Jesse was in love, while he was merely playing with her feelings and exploiting her. The prosecution tried to prove it was a crime driven by jealousy. He had told his lover they couldn't have anything serious because he loved his wife and wouldn't leave his family. This made Jesse jealous and angry. Unable to control her emotions, she wanted revenge on her lover's wife and planned to eliminate her rival. Jesse likely thought that once his wife was dead, Elaine would return to her. The star witness at the hearing was Elaine himself. He repeated the story of his affair with the accused that had led up to the tragedy. The man immediately suspected who was behind his wife's murder, for no one else could have committed such an atrocity. Elaine added that he felt responsible for what had happened. It turned out that Jesse was not the only woman with whom he had cheated on his wife, but he had never wanted such a tragic outcome. Elaine had continued his relationship with Jesse, but did so under conditions that promised her more, and over time, perhaps she simply could not bear it and broke. Their relationship lasted almost until the fateful day. In fact, just 1 month before the murder, Elaine had brought Jesse home, where they were intimate. The prosecution demanded the maximum sentence for Jesse Etherty, years in prison, without the possibility of parole for the premeditated murder of Eloise. The trial was very difficult for both Jessie and her family. On the third day of deliberations, she fainted from anxiety. The jury took a long time to agree on a sentence for the accused. Many believed it was a crime of passion or manslaughter. Nevertheless, Jessie was found guilty of premeditated murder. On February 6, 2016, the judge sentenced her to 30 years in prison. This was rather surprising given the defendant's supposedly calm demeanor. Jessie's parents were in shock and left the courtroom in silence. Jessie's lawyer announced plans to appeal the controversial verdict, but it has not yet been overturned. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves. Many people are willing to help and truly want to do good in this world. Those who act best in such situations are those who have experienced hardship and deprivation themselves and are now being challenged. However, not everyone wants to help. If you face such a person and try with all your might to help them, you can cause enormous harm, even with fatal consequences. Yet as today's story shows, sometimes the consequences are tragic for the helper themselves. Tammy Epperson was an attractive woman who had worked in the modeling industry for many years. She ended her work in that field a few years before the events in question. Her career failure was due to her addiction to certain substances, and she spent her entire life in Los Angeles' disadvantaged neighborhood known as Skid Row, unable to resist temptation. By the age of 30, she was addicted to illegal substances. Fortunately, Tammy recognized her situation and did not want to accept it, so she decided to complete a rehabilitation program. By 2000, she had managed to change her life completely. At that point, the woman was 38 years old. Despite her long struggle with addiction, she took advantage of her second chance. Tammy pulled herself together and broke the cycle. By the time of the events in question, she had fully overcome her addiction, had begun living again, and decided to help others so they too would have the chance to turn their lives around. Tammy lived in Burlington Plaza, a publicly funded housing complex built to give people a fresh start, those who had only just begun fighting their addictions, and those who had already managed to overcome them. For many, it was a true fortress, separating those who suffered from the crime that thrived outside the complex walls. There was a fence and round-the-clock security. Before entering, every visitor had to sign a special register, and when leaving, they were also logged. Unfortunately, none of these measures were sufficient for Tammy. She lived in a small apartment on the ground floor, but an intruder attacked her inside the building. It was a brutal crime, a prime example of extreme violence that was shocking even for Skid Row. When police investigators arrived at the building on the 13th of November, 2000, around 9 p.m., they saw that the walls and floor were covered in blood. The intruder had been so violent that blood was literally everywhere, even on the ceiling. For many police officers, this case stood out as the most striking manifestation of human cruelty, something that would remain etched in their minds for the rest of their lives. At the crime scene, investigators found a complete wreck. In the small 10 by -12-meter apartment, everything that could be broken had been destroyed: furniture, glass and ceramic items, household appliances. Everything lay smashed and scattered on the floor. All of these objects were also covered in blood. Tammy's belongings were scattered around the bed, as though the intruder had been searching for something specific. The officers suspected he might have been looking for money or illegal substances. The massacre's victim lay in a pool of blood on the floor. She was partially undressed, her underwear pulled down, and her face badly disfigured. The insides of her thighs and her groin area were torn and lacerated. Because of her posture, the injuries, and the missing clothing, investigators assumed she could have been a victim of rape. From the very first seconds at the scene, the officers had an eerie feeling. Several medical examiners working in the building could not endure the horrifying sight. There was blood everywhere, and the condition of the body was appalling. Due to the small space and the attacker's unbelievable brutality, blood spatter covered every surface. According to police, the perpetrator attacked the 38-year-old woman, slamming her against the wall several times. She instantly suffered severe injuries that would have left her disoriented or even unconscious. Unfortunately, that did not seem to satisfy the attacker, who continued beating her long after Tammy was already on the floor, using whatever came to hand. It was clear that a significant amount of time passed during this brutal massacre. The unknown assailant initially struck down the resident of the apartment, then methodically searched everything, tossing and shattering items all around. However, at the time of the attack, not one neighbor called the police. According to investigators, the state of the corpse's decomposition suggested that Tammy had died at least 24 hours before the police arrived. Yet every neighbor claimed they had heard nothing, which was clearly a lie because the apartments were not soundproof, and the scale of destruction was too great to go unnoticed. In reality, a close friend of the victim did file a report with the police. He did not know what had happened to the woman, but after being unable to reach her for several hours and hearing from a third party that Tammy was probably dead, he went to the authorities. It turned out that the police had no information about the incident, but they found the man's statement compelling enough to dispatch a patrol to check if everything was all right in her apartment. Even a quick examination of the body showed that the assailant had exhibited extremely violent behavior. He obviously had a strong reason for this aggression, or held a long-standing grudge, because Tammy had been slaughtered with horrifying brutality. Her once attractive face was so disfigured it was unrecognizable. One of her eyes had been gouged out, and her throat had been slashed multiple times with glass shards. She was hit in the face at least 3 times with what was probably a large screwdriver that the police found under her shoulder. The puncture wounds were deep and round, indicating that this was the weapon used. One of the investigators immediately suggested that the attacker's motive might have been the woman's beauty. Tammy was, in fact, very attractive. It seemed someone wanted to destroy that beauty, and the perpetrator succeeded. All the blows focused on the victim's face and neck. These were deep stab and slash wounds that left her no chance of surviving the brutal assault. A blood spatter specialist was summoned to the scene. In these circumstances, he analyzed the apartment's horrifying condition and reconstructed the events as accurately as possible. He spent 7 hours collecting data in the victim's apartment and piecing it together into a complete picture of the crime scene, followed by several more hours of continuous analysis to gather, process, and systematize the evidence. Numerous traces of blood were found in the bathroom, while the body was in the living room. The victim was probably attacked while she was in the bathroom. Several bloody marks that could have been made when the victim's bloody head was pressed against the wall were discovered. There were multiple similar impressions at different heights, as if someone had strangled her and lifted her from the floor. Also, the bathroom door was closed at the time of the attack, as indicated by the blood droplets on the inside of the door. A trail of blood led from the bathroom to the living room, suggesting the assailant carried the victim's body in his arms into the living room, letting the blood drip downward. Tammy was then laid on the floor, and the torture continued. Apparently, it was then that she received deep stab wounds with the screwdriver and cuts to her throat, which eventually led to her death. The forensic team had a lot of work to do, because the assailant used multiple murder weapons. He not only stabbed the victim in the face with a screwdriver, but also used glass shards found in the room to slash her throat. Several pieces of furniture, including a wooden chair leg, also looked suspicious. Everything was covered in blood and left at the crime scene, meaning it might contain valuable evidence and DNA material to help identify the ruthless murderer. All this material was collected and sent to the lab for thorough examination. It was assumed that the attacker had injured himself during such a bloodbath, so the medical examiners hoped to find his blood as well. Among the household items used by the intruder was an ottoman, which investigators initially could not identify. It was literally smashed into small pieces but appeared to be covered in blood. An unidentified glass object, initially believed by the investigators to be a lamp, was in a similar condition. The lab, however, determined it was actually a heavy flower vase. That decorative item had apparently been broken into several parts, each bearing numerous bloodstains. These shards looked as though they had been used to slash the victim's throat and strike her. Forensic experts believe the attacker broke all these objects on his victim, as she lay unconscious in the middle of the room. This fiend took one object after another, striking Tammy until the object was completely shattered, then picking up the next one and repeating the process. The most striking aspect was that the building's residents completely ignored the accompanying commotion. Investigators found out that the attacker had smashed, one after the other, a candlestick in the bathroom, then an ottoman, a vase, and finally a lamp, which had the most blood on it. While inspecting the victim's small apartment, officers found several valuable pieces of evidence. In the bathroom sink lay a bloody rag likely containing traces of the attacker's blood. As it turned out later, it bore Tammy's DNA, indicating that the killer had tried to clean up the blood. Once he realized the extent of the mess and how long it might take to deal with it, he left everything as it was and fled. A water bottle with a red fingerprint was also discovered. In the trash were numerous paper towels bearing similar prints. In addition to the beating, Tammy had been raped, as her underwear and clothing were pulled down. These suspicions were confirmed by the medical examiner, who found blood in the victim's intimate areas that indicated contact with the attacker after the blows had been inflicted. The medical examiner took a swab from the body to determine the suspect's DNA. Given the nature of the attack, police immediately began searching for enemies in Tammy's immediate circle. In her apartment, they found several items that she apparently considered precious and had framed, but no photos of family members, friends, or men, just pictures of her modeling work, a training certificate, and a confirmation of her participation in a rehab program. Tammy was clearly proud of these things. The apartment was neat, clean, and tidy, decorated with angels and flowers. It did not look like the typical home of someone struggling with substance abuse or living a life close to the underworld. Based on what people said, both from her personal circle and elsewhere, Tammy really had overcome her addiction and was leading a normal life. However, she still had suspicious individuals in her environment who struggled with substance abuse. A few years earlier, Tammy herself was in a tough criminal milieu, but she managed not only to overcome her addiction to illegal substances, she also found a fairly respectable job. She became an office manager for a Hollywood telephone service that dealt with celebrities. In addition, she volunteered at a church near her residential complex, helping people with addiction problems. Tammy agreed to do this because she saw it as a way to help those in need. Since the attacker had aimed to destroy her beauty, and she was a very attractive woman, the police suspected the perpetrator might be a spurned lover or a secret admirer who had never declared himself to Tammy. Almost immediately, the investigators got a lead on a possible suspect. One of the complex's residents, who wished to remain anonymous, told them about the alleged killer. The first suspect's name was Ronald Sims, or simply Ron. The man had been seriously addicted to illegal substances for a long time and continued to struggle with them. He had also been involved with Tammy romantically for some time. Their relationship ended when she managed to overcome her cravings, while Ron was never able to break the cycle, though they remained on friendly terms and stayed in contact, as Tammy believed Ron needed her help. She would advise him and set a good example. The police immediately reached out to Ron as a potential killer, but he denied any guilt. He claimed he was friends with Tammy. They had never argued, and he would not have harmed her. Instead, Ron told a darker story. He maintained that he had stayed in contact with Tammy not just to deal with his own problems, but also to protect her. Apparently, during the counseling sessions at the church, Tammy met a suspicious man who soon began stalking her. Because of that man, Ron started supporting her. The man's name was Troy Powell. At the time of Tammy's death, he was 32 years old and on probation after a recent stint in prison. It turned out that all three, Tammy, Ron, and Troy, were friends, moved in the same circles, and attended the same church. However, Troy claimed to have been in love with Tammy from the moment they met. He would see her after work, bringing flowers and teddy bears. Nearly every day, he waited for her in his pickup truck in front of the church and offered her a ride. At that time, there was a bus driver strike in the city, and sometimes Tammy accepted Troy's offer, though she usually preferred to get a ride with someone else. Troy suffered from an addiction, and the deceased felt he was potentially dangerous, so she rarely accepted his help. She had more than once confided in her ex, Ron, that she only agreed to ride with Troy in emergencies, considering it less risky than walking the dangerous streets of one of the city's most crime-ridden neighborhoods. Her agreement, however, was misunderstood by Troy, who became increasingly convinced that he had a chance at a romantic relationship with Tammy. In reality, she was forced into accepting his help because of her circumstances, and also genuinely wanted to help him face his problems. She gave him advice and tried to support him while still clearly keeping her distance, as she did not want any kind of romantic involvement. Tammy repeatedly made it clear to him, but Troy became ever more persistent. Lately, Troy's obsession had worsened, and Tammy started avoiding him. Her relatives said he might have been involved in her murder. Troy was known to be jealous, aggressive, and deeply obsessed with Tammy, making him a potential suspect in the eyes of the police and those who knew about his involvement with her. In Tammy's apartment, the officers found a disturbing piece of evidence, an address book, in which she recorded all the calls from this suspicious man. There were countless notes indicating when Troy called, how long the call lasted, and what the outcome was, including whether there were threats or similar incidents. Most of these notes ended with Tammy asking Troy not to bother her anymore, but he kept calling, sometimes the very same day, and over a long period. The situation escalated when one of Troy's acquaintances informed Ron that the suspect had admitted killing her. When Ron heard this, he immediately called the police and reported Troy's confession. According to the witness, Troy said he had gone to see Tammy. They had a pleasant time, then had sex, but an argument broke out, and in his rage, he killed her. Despite the detailed account, police were not convinced Ron was telling the whole truth and took him into custody for clarification. Ron initially remained on the suspect list because he was a criminal with a prior theft conviction and a possible motive jealousy of an ex-girlfriend. However, he was later released due to lack of evidence. Meanwhile, Troy could not be found. He vanished in a city of 4 million people. It was believed he had gone on the run, having gotten a few hours head start. A review of Burlington Plaza's logbook showed that Troy had indeed entered the building on the day of the murder and left several hours later. When he exited, he was asked about Tammy, because residents were not permitted to leave the building unaccompanied. Troy smiled and told security that Tammy was resting. This answer was enough for the guards, and they let him go. Troy was the last person to visit Tammy's apartment, further heightening suspicion. Ron stated that, on the same day, he and Tammy had arranged to go to work at the church, but when he tried calling her, she did not pick up. This struck him as strange, because she always enjoyed talking to him on the phone. The church noted that Tammy had not shown up. The next morning, Ron went to see her at work, but she was not there either. Ron, who had relapsed into using illegal substances, could not get into the housing complex, but he noticed that Troy's red pickup truck was parked outside, which worried him. Ron kept calling Tammy persistently, but she never answered, so he turned to the police. Investigators gradually pieced together what had likely happened on that fateful day. In their view, Troy picked up Tammy from church the evening before the murder, and they stopped at a shop to buy a Bible, which Tammy gave Troy, believing he was finally on the road to recovery. Possibly he talked her into letting him come over, perhaps on the pretext of needing help with his addiction. Tammy's close friends claimed she would not give him another chance, but she was somewhat naive, so maybe he just convinced her he needed guidance and advice in dealing with his drug problems. She was a kind person who believed she could help make the world a better place, and probably could not say no, allowing him into her apartment. Tragically, she trusted people around her who were far from perfect. Investigators checked Troy Powell's criminal record and found a long list of offenses, including serious crimes such as using and distributing illegal substances, burglary, and rape. He had already served time for an attack on another woman he had also stalked. She survived his assault by some miracle. He was clearly a danger to society, especially to women. Troy was very masculine, muscular, and tall, the kind of tough guy who might attract women. The police initiated a search for his vehicle, the red pickup, which Ron was able to describe in detail, as he had often seen Troy with Tammy in that truck. The day after investigators first arrived at the massacre scene, they received a tip. Troy had been spotted at a friend's house in San Pedro, about 30 kilometers away, apparently hiding there from another man who was also on probation. The police rushed to the address. They learned Troy had left his pickup behind and run off about 45 minutes earlier. Since the suspect was no longer using his vehicle, he could have vanished into the city's crowds. However, the following morning, the officers got lucky. The pickup was removed during the night, and one of the patrol officers who regularly checked the local probation office spotted an unfamiliar vehicle in the parking lot, a conspicuous red pickup. The officer ran the license plate and confirmed it was Troy's. The investigators were notified and arrived on scene to arrest the main suspect. They staked out the vehicle, waiting for the killer to come retrieve it. A big, brawny man eventually appeared as the driver. The most suspicious thing was his baseball cap, on which the investigators found blood drops. However, the man in custody gave his name as Charles Varney, and after checking his documents, it turned out he was telling the truth. Still, the police decided to detain him and test the red stains on his cap. He said that his friend Troy had given him the truck the previous day and taken off during the night, along with his jacket, camera, and other possessions. Indeed, the two had been cellmates, remaining in contact after their release. Officers immediately searched the motel room, finding a film in the camera. After it was developed, photos showed Tammy with Charles and Troy. Charles said they had all met at the church where Tammy helped people with addiction problems. Unfortunately, the DNA test took much longer, but it was ultimately revealed that the blood on the baseball cap did not belong to the murder victim. Charles was questioned again and eventually admitted having important information, but he was willing to share it only in exchange for protection from prosecution. The officers agreed. According to the criminal, Troy had admitted murdering his so-called beloved, who never returned his feelings. He gave Charles his pickup truck and fled from the police. At the same time, his former cellmate said the killer was open to the possibility of surrendering voluntarily. Charles insisted he had nothing to do with the crime, but during questioning, he mentioned details that only the perpetrator or a direct witness could know. He was aware that Tammy's throat had been slashed and that she had been stabbed multiple times in the face with a screwdriver. It was unclear whether Troy told him these details or Charles was present at the scene. Regardless, Charles was forced to cooperate with the investigation and revealed that Troy had called him that same day at 7 p.m. The man agreed to help the police capture the murderer. The two buddies spoke by phone, allowing the police to track down the address where the criminal was hiding. Troy was arrested at his motel while he was watching an adult film. Tammy's keys to her office were found there. Troy intended to burglarize it. His DNA was found on the deceased's body following the rape, and numerous bloody fingerprints were discovered on many objects. The victim's blood was also on his clothing, so there was no doubt Troy was guilty. In Troy's confession, he admitted to killing Tammy, but claimed to have been in poor mental health. He said he suffered from mental disorders and had not been taking his prescribed medication for a long time because he had no money to buy it. He claimed he went to see Tammy. They had consensual sex because they were in a relationship, and later Tammy got a phone call from another man. This infuriated Troy, and Tammy refused to talk with him about it and simply went to the bathroom. Troy followed her, locked the door, and punched her multiple times in the head. He claimed he remembered nothing after that. By this time, the analysis of the collected evidence had been completed. All the fingerprints belonged to Troy. The forensic scientists now suspected the crime involved not just rape and beatings but also torture. Troy was charged with premeditated murder, burglary, rape, and torture. Taken together, these charges were strong enough for the prosecution to seek the death penalty. Troy, however, was not ready to give up so easily. He insisted he had a lifelong mental disorder that rendered him unfit to stand trial, so the hearing had to be postponed pending psychiatric evaluation. That evaluation concluded the killer had not been out of his mind during the attack. He had detailed the sequence of events to his friend Charles, who became one of the prosecution's main witnesses. Troy himself cited childhood trauma as the reason for the attack. He claimed he had suffered cruelty from an alcoholic father throughout his youth, leading to abnormalities that made him unable to handle Tammy's rejection without flying into a rage and losing control. All of this was supported by a psychiatrist. One of the most significant parts of the hearing was Troy's own testimony as a defense witness. Normally, such appearances are disadvantageous to the defendant, but Troy was familiar with the legal system, so his story sounded fairly coherent. He admitted he might have been the murderer, but asserted that he could not remember anything. At the same time, he believed the woman was still alive when he left the apartment, so he claimed the killing was unintentional. Troy also denied having any issues with women, contrary to what his psychiatrist described. On Troy's side were his mother and 2 sisters, all of whom testified that he had physically attacked them before, causing serious injury. He had even broken his mother's spine and, years before, pushed his sister down the stairs, then claimed memory loss. Nevertheless, his family continued to insist he was a good person, incapable of such brutality. The forensic evidence, however, said otherwise. One of the most horrifying statements from the prosecutor was that Troy had tortured his victim for a considerable time before she died. Medical examiners noted tears in the victim's perineum. According to experts, these were the worst mutilations they had ever seen in their careers, indicating a prolonged savage beating rather than any consensual intimacy. The jury found Troy Powell guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution on death row at San Quentin Prison. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves. Religiosity sometimes borders on fanaticism. Is it possible to receive a kind of divine revelation, or is it merely a particularly well-developed intuition? Whatever the case, Faylene was very religious, felt the cold breath of death, and she was not wrong. The area around the city of Phoenix in the U.S. state of Utah is a breathtakingly beautiful place, exuding an atmosphere of calm and serenity. This is where Faylene Grant lived, who sincerely believed that she could communicate directly with God. She claimed to hear angels and to have regular visions. She even kept a diary in which she meticulously recorded all these revelations, not realizing what an important role it would play in the future. In the summer of 2001, a man called the emergency hotline asking for help for Faylene Grant. Paramedics arrived on the scene, provided assistance, and took her to a hospital, where she was admitted immediately to intensive care. The only hope was that she would regain consciousness and explain what had really happened, but her vital signs continued to deteriorate. Soon her brain activity ceased. Her husband Doug authorized the withdrawal of life support measures. At 4:37 p.m. on the 27th of September, 2001, 30-year-old Faylene Grant was pronounced dead. Doug Grant, Fayne's husband, recounted that he woke up that morning and did not find his wife in bed, but heard the sound of water running in the bathroom. Concerned that she had been gone for too long, he decided to see what was going on and found Faylene face down in the water. He pulled her out and carried her into the bedroom, where he tried to revive her until help arrived. The medical examiner concluded that her death was the result of an accident, but the specialist's report indicated that the exact cause was still undetermined. In such a case where murder might be involved, the police have more latitude. The medical examiner found no traces or marks on the body suggesting a struggle or crime, yet the situation seemed so unusual that the police decided to conduct a thorough investigation. When reviewing the circumstances of her death, the officers began to suspect that Fayleen's drowning was not accidental. She was described as a devout Mormon from a deeply religious family and extremely devout woman who claimed to have revelations from God. According to her faith, taking one's own life was a terrible sin, and given her strong convictions, suicide seemed inconceivable. However, shortly before her death, she had told a story that God was preparing her for death. For this reason, she took out a life insurance policy, hoping to leave something behind. She also planned her funeral in advance, carefully selecting the course of events and the music. It turned out that Fen had planned her own death in a way, and had even told her husband that, after she died, he should marry a certain woman she had chosen specifically. Her husband spoke with great fondness of his late wife, describing her as loving and very strong. Their love story had begun in 1993, when he met a pretty single mother named Fayleen Ives at a fitness studio near Phoenix. At the time, he himself was divorced. Both he and Fayleen had gone through failed relationships, and both were Mormons. In fact, Doug and Fayleen had known each other since high school, but it was only at the fitness studio that the spark ignited. They began dating. Their relationship developed quickly, and 4 months later they married. The couple traveled extensively around the world. Doug remembered those times warmly. They were both well-educated, looked after their health through a proper diet and regular workouts, and were members of the Mormon Church leading devout Christian lives. They had 2 boys together and formed a large blended family with 4 children. Yet in the months before her death, Fayleen seemed to have delved even deeper into her faith and often behaved oddly, though she had always loved life. Her own decision to leave this world willingly seemed unimaginable. Still, Doug did not consider other options. Many people, who were concerned about this tragedy, worried that her love for religion might be excessive, but Doug believed that was not the case. He insisted her belief in God was moderate. Her devotion to God was constant, but she never stopped being herself and never fell into fanaticism. On the contrary, her faith had always sustained her, and she willingly followed the moral principles laid out in the Holy Scriptures. Doug shared his wife's religious views only to a much lesser degree, being more focused on his business. In the mid-1990s, he managed to start a company selling nutritional supplements, and later he became a sports nutrition consultant. He achieved a lot, even advising NBA teams. He built an entire professional sports network from scratch, which allowed him to earn a good deal of money so that his family lived comfortably and lacked nothing. But Doug also had a Doug side. The well-known man fell for women, and at some point, Feen began to suspect him of infidelity. God confirmed her suspicions, although her husband denied everything. This was a severe blow for Fayleen. According to her vision, what had happened was a great sin, but to save their marriage and support the children, she stayed with her husband. Unfortunately, this did not change the situation. God revealed once more that her husband was unfaithful. Her husband finally confessed that he had cheated on her with 6 women, and that was the last straw. On God's advice, Fayleen filed for divorce in 2001. Despite her resentment, it was a painful and difficult decision because she still loved her husband. According to friends, she cried a lot, almost every night. Yet, for the children's sake, the couple decided to remain in close contact and maintain their relationship. Even so, after the divorce, Fayleen had to move out with the children. It is difficult to say whether she was hoping to restore their relationship, but Doug seemed completely fine with the way things were. He soon began a relationship with a 19-year-old beauty queen from Louisiana named Hillary Dweed, who was nearly half his age. Right after his divorce, Doug repeatedly told his friends he would never marry again, but only a few weeks into his relationship with Hillary, he realized he could not live without her. The young employee of his company gladly accepted his advances. Their relationship lasted several months, and Doug was already planning to propose to Hillary. But in August 2001, everything changed. Faylene called her ex-husband, asking him to come for an urgent talk, saying she had experienced a vision in the Mormon temple she had recently visited. God, she claimed, told her that she should remarry Doug. This was a shock for him, but after thinking it over, he listened to her words and spoke of reconciliation and reviving their relationship. After this conversation, Doug called Hillary and admitted he was returning to his ex-wife. At that point, it seemed obvious that his relationship with his lover was over, yet that was only the beginning of the story. Hillary had strong feelings for him and did not want the relationship to end. When the police learned of the circumstances of Finn's death, they developed serious doubts that it was an accident and suspected something far more sinister. The existence of a love triangle gave everyone involved a motive. Investigators decided to take a closer look at the last few months of Faylene's life to understand what could have driven a devout, cheerful Christian woman to end her life. They also considered the possibility that her husband, or even his young lover, might have wanted to get rid of her. They needed solid proof, though, and the motive itself remained questionable. No one was forcing the husband to stay. There was no dispute over property or custody, and there was no financial motive. They had reconciled, so it did not seem that Doug had any reason to want Faylene dead. At this point, he believed she had taken her own life, but he could not explain why. Doug also spoke of the fact that his deeply religious wife had received revelations, maintaining in all seriousness that she truly had the gift of foresight, and he provided the police with valuable information about the diary she had kept for several years. Whatever revelation Finn experienced in the San Diego temple remains a mystery, but afterward, she insisted on renewing her marriage with her husband. Only a few days after this revelation, they were standing in a chapel in Las Vegas, saying their vows again and becoming husband and wife once more. People close to Finn were skeptical of the renewed relationship, but Faylene remained calm, and Doug seemed changed. However, during a phone call after the wedding, Faylene's sister noticed that she never once said she loved him. It appeared the woman considered reuniting for the children's sake, not for her own. This reunion with Doug broke Hillary's heart, yet, despite these conflicting accounts, events took shape that turned into a strange love triangle, because, as it turned out, Doug did not want to give up his young lover even after remarrying Faylene. They continued to see each other. For journalists covering the story of the deceased woman, every new detail of this tangled relationship was a treat. Finn's diary, in which she recorded her revelations, was especially important. All of it generated enormous public interest and fueled widespread rumors that the deceased's family tried to fight. In her diary, Finn wrote extensively about her visions, her faith, and her family. It was all well written, reminiscent of a mentor's speech. After reuniting with Doug, Faylene sent Hillary many messages on social media and by email. None of them were angry. They resembled parental guidance, as though, at that point, her belief in her impending death had reached its peak. And she now viewed Hillary as Doug's future wife and the stepmother to her children. When investigators checked Hillary's phone records, they found constant calls with Doug. He insisted they were discussing Finn's condition, which everyone found so troubling. However, investigators suspected there was something much worse going on, and they also believed that Faylene was unaware that her husband's affair had never actually ended. At the same time, her diaries were filled with revelations about her death. She did not speak of voluntarily leaving this world, but wrote that relentless fate had shown her a future in which she would no longer be alive. As a devout Mormon, she accepted her fate and seemed resigned to it. One could see similar feelings on her social media. On the 7th of September, she chatted with her sisters and stated that, only 6 days earlier, she had felt the breath of death. Finn was surprised she was still alive. On the 17th of September, she contacted her relatives again, telling them that she would soon be gone and saying her goodbyes. The last month of Finn's life passed with these kinds of revelations, which everyone close to her heard. She even spoke to her physical therapist about it, who advised her not to dwell on such things and to focus on tangible problems. The doctor attributed her behavior to stress, believing that her fatalistic attitude would soon pass. She turned to Hillary, asking her to look after the children if this happened. Following these words, Hillary decided to visit Faylene, trying to figure out the cause of her gloomy thoughts. During this meeting, Faylene insisted that the young lover take her place in Doug's life after she was gone. She asked her to marry him and formally adopt their children. It all sounded strange, and investigators had plenty of questions for the trio. They noticed that all this happened while the newlyweds were planning a second honeymoon. They wanted to visit some of the most sacred sites of the Mormon faith, which had long been a dream of Faylene's. She insisted that now was the time to do it, as there would never be another opportunity. The couple went to the Nauvoo Temple in Illinois, but suddenly Fen herself changed their plans, saying they should visit the Timpanogos Cave in the mountains of Utah. Surprisingly, it was at the edge of a cliff there that Faylene almost died. Standing near the cliff's edge, she looked up and claimed to see an image of Jesus in the clouds. Doug had taken a photo of his wife just seconds earlier and was convinced she was dead. It turned out that, after a fall of about 20 meters, she was not seriously injured, which seemed like a miracle. According to Doug, he realized that surviving such a fall, let alone emerging with no serious wounds, was nearly impossible. He said he was so startled that he had no time to help her or pull her away from the edge of the cliff, and it all happened right before his eyes. He took her to a local hospital, where doctors treated her minor injuries, such as scratches and scrapes. She had no broken bones, only bruises. Even the doctors found it hard to believe she had fallen from a height of 20 meters. However, Faylene insisted on this version of events. The terrain was filled with sharp, jagged rocks, which could easily have caused lacerations and fatal injuries. The devout woman saw this miraculous occurrence as a sign from above, and the police suspected that Doug had somehow orchestrated the entire incident. In light of the diary's references to divine revelations, it seemed that Faylene knew what lay ahead when she traveled with her husband. To her great despair, she merely accepted it as her fate. It was no longer possible to find out how she really felt or why she did not try to prevent it. In questioning, Doug described the morning he found his wife dead. He said that since the fall from the cliff, he had experienced sleep problems and was taking sleeping pills a doctor friend had recommended and prescribed. He claimed he had no idea how his wife could have drowned in the bathtub. The widower stuck to his story that it was an accident, but did not rule out that she might have taken her own life. The prosecution, however, took a completely different view. The authorities and many of the deceased's relatives were convinced it was no accident. Moreover, there were no reliable witnesses for the prosecution to rely on, and only much later did they emerge. Fen's sister called the investigators with important news. An old friend of Doug claimed that Doug had confessed to murdering his wife, allegedly saying that since she was ready to go to heaven, he had simply submerged her in the bathtub until she drowned. But the witness demanded a large sum of money from Faylene's family in exchange for his testimony. The investigators met with the man and persuaded him to participate without compensation, and he agreed. He invited his friend Doug for a talk while wearing a wire. The man did everything he could to get Doug to confess, but Doug never explicitly admitted to anything, although he was clearly nervous and evasive. It all looked suspicious. In the summer of 2005, the police arrested Doug and charged him with murdering his wife. He posted bail immediately and returned home to await trial. It was not until 7 years after Fane Grant's death that Doug was brought to trial. This was a terrible blow to the victim's entire family, who did not want to revisit the events or relive them in detail. It was especially painful for Fen's brother Jay, who said there had never been a day after her death when he did not think of her. He was certain that the victim would never have taken her own life, and doubted she had drowned by accident. Everyone wanted justice and answers. Even the woman's adult children found it difficult to accept what had happened. The trial lasted 4 months and became a highly publicized case. The media followed the proceedings with great excitement. Many witnesses came forward, reporting various suspicious circumstances before and after the woman's death. For example, Doug's sister Tammy visited the couple's home immediately after the cliff incident. Tammy believed that Faylene had not intended to return from that trip. She said there were notes from Mormon scriptures, bags containing personal items, and instructions on who should receive them. Tammy believed Faylene saw death coming and had jumped off the cliff herself. When Tammy returned to her brother's home after Faylene's death, she noticed even more such messages. To her surprise, she found temple clothing laid out on the couple's bed, items that were deeply significant to the deceased right up to her final days, which she usually never displayed publicly. Tammy's discovery was alarming. She said there were many other objects of religious significance, and the whole thing seemed frightening, as though Fen truly wanted to die and had prepared for it. Disturbing notes were stuck on mirrors, indicating how thoroughly she had accepted her fate, apparently without intending to change or even attempt to avoid it. Considering all this, and the accident in the mountains, some of her relatives began to believe that she had indeed chosen to end her life. From another perspective, her actions did not make much sense. She showed no signs of despair or depression, neither took illegal substances nor drank alcohol, and remained calm to the end. But could Doug really have driven the mother of his own children to death? During the trial, Doug revealed new details, saying that after their trip to Utah and the accidental fall from the cliff, Faylene started believing in a miracle. She said she no longer felt the evil doom that had been hovering over her. Once they were home, she still had some bruising and spent several days sleeping poorly, but she seemed to have recovered her zest for life. Exhausted from all the traveling and hospital visits, Doug just wanted to rest, while his wife could not sleep well. Hoping to help, he contacted his friend, a physician's assistant at the hospital nearby, who came to examine her. The doctor found nothing seriously wrong and felt she just needed rest and time to recover. To ease her discomfort, he gave her an injection for the pain and prescribed her painkillers and a sedative. Then, according to Doug, who was also exhausted, he told his wife that if she could not sleep, she should take the medication prescribed by the doctor. With that, Doug took his sleeping pills and went to bed. The next morning, he found his wife dead. The prosecution insisted that even if he was not directly involved in the drowning, he had acted with criminal negligence. He knew she was in pain, having death visions, and was under the influence of painkillers and sedatives, yet he left her alone and did not help her. Equally suspicious to the prosecution was Doug's behavior after the incident. In statements, he claimed he was the one who called emergency services, although in reality, it was the doctor who had prescribed Faylene's medication. That morning, when Doug found his wife in the bathtub, he pulled her out of the water, placed her on the bed, and started running around the house in a panic, trying to save her. Faylene's oldest daughter, Jenna, witnessed this and went with her younger brothers to the neighbor, the same doctor who had prescribed the medication. The doctor rushed over and called 911 on his way. Doug screamed and pleaded for someone to help Faylene, while the doctor did whatever he could. Doug explained away the investigation's accusation of a false statement by saying he had been confused and in shock over his wife's death. The prosecutors, however, interpreted it as a ploy to hide something worse than mere negligence. A toxicology report confirmed the investigators' suspicions. The victim's blood contained such a high level of sedatives that she definitely would not have been able to move about the house on her own. This supported the theory that her husband had placed her in a tub full of water, depriving her of any chance to get away, so that she drowned while he slept. Upon waking, he began acting out his story. Unexpectedly, investigators located a witness who fully confirmed this version of events, the eldest daughter. She had been in the hallway at the time of her mother's death, and believed she saw her stepfather carry her mother into the room and close the door behind him. She had no idea what happened behind that door, did not see her mother being submerged, and initially told the police nothing. Years later, after realizing what had happened, she became determined to obtain justice for her mother, haunted by the guilt that she had done nothing. Doug, for his part, was oblivious to the fact that Jenna was awake early that morning, and he did not realize that her mother was dying just behind the door. The girl later confessed that if she had knocked or gone in, she might have saved Faylene, though she could not have predicted how her stepfather would react to a witness. At trial, the prosecution portrayed Doug as a cold-blooded murderer, violent and potentially dangerous, a depiction that angered the people who had come to support him. They presented his love for Hillary as the motive, arguing that he had attempted to kill his wife at least twice. They held him responsible for the Cliff incident, interpreting Faylene's divine revelations in different ways but concluding that her death was no accident. The defense insisted it was a matter of unfortunate coincidences and that the police had been trying from the start to pin the blame on the husband, resulting in a flawed and incomplete investigation. The defense lawyer pointed out the poor quality of several pieces of physical evidence on which the inquiry relied. Much of the collected evidence was lost or destroyed, including clothing and the pills Faylene had taken, all of which was attributed to incompetence among the medical examiners and investigators. Moreover, none of Fenn's diary entries had been examined. According to the lawyer, Faylene had recently taken out a new life insurance policy for a considerable sum, but at the time of her death it was not yet in effect, so even if wealthy Doug had needed the money, he would have had to wait to receive it. Also, Faylene was on good terms with Hillary, and the two women seemed to get along, so there was no issue. The defense therefore argued there was no valid motive for murder. The prosecution insisted he was a manipulative abuser who had driven his wife to the brink so that she would appear religiously delusional, making it seem she had ended her own life. From the prosecution's viewpoint, all of her divine revelations revolve around Doug. Even when she foresaw her own death, her husband was there, which they viewed as clear evidence of his involvement in the tragedy. Hillary herself supported Doug in court and argued for his acquittal. She had been greatly influenced by the messages the deceased had sent her shortly before dying, asking Hillary to become Doug's wife and adopt her children. Hillary went along with it. 3 weeks after the tragedy, she married Doug and adopted the children Faylene and Doug had together. Meanwhile, Faylene's 2 children from her first marriage went to live with their biological father. Hillary had a daughter with Doug, and during the first years of their marriage, she had to endure constant judgment from people who truly believed she played a key role in Faylene's death, and that everything in the Grant family's life had gone wrong because of her. Hillary constantly wondered whether the same thing that happened to Doug's first wife could happen to her. She insisted, however, that he never abused her. The prosecution noted that Doug did not seem to behave like a grieving widower after Faylene's death. Only a few hours after the tragedy, he drove to see his lover. When he arrived, he pressed his body against her car, hugged her, and whispered sweet things in her ear. That was clearly not the behavior of a man mourning his wife. It seemed obvious he was relieved by events. In her testimony, Faylene's daughter described her suspicions about Doug. She believed her stepfather had brainwashed her mother into believing she had a divine gift and had to die, so that she would prepare for her own death. She felt he deserved the full weight of the law. But the children Doug had with Faylene supported their father's acquittal. They had already lost their mother and did not want to lose him too. The prosecution considered various charges, from first-degree murder to second-degree murder or manslaughter, any of which would carry at least a 10-year prison sentence. The jury deliberated for a long time, ultimately finding Doug guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to a term of years in prison. Although that penalty may seem too small, the victim's family still remains uncertain whether he was truly guilty and whether he deserved punishment at all. The controversial case still raises more questions than it answers. Doug was released from prison in 2014. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.